Okay, today's story is a bit different. It comes from a post shared by an internet user, but I can't guarantee if it's actually true. Chinese netizens have been going back and forth on this, half believe it's completely made up, while the other half insist it's real. But either way, I thought it was quite an interesting story, so I wanted to share it with everyone. Of course, this isn't the entire post. I've picked out some of the better parts because the original is really long, around 50,000 Chinese characters. If I were to adapt all of it for my channel, that'd take me roughly 8 episodes to cover. Alright, enough talk, let's jump right in. I had never encountered or seen them myself growing up, but my family had numerous unexpected run-ins with them, leaving me feeling both scared and unsettled. Back when I was in elementary school, my family lived in a small village called Bayi Mulberry Farm. My mom spent her time raising silkworms, and my dad worked as a movie projectionist at the town cinema, coming home once or twice a week. My younger brother and I were still in school, and our grandmother stayed at home to take care of us. Later, when the government introduced a new residency policy, my parents wanted to move to the city to buy a new house, so I could attend a better school. But during the trip to find a house, our savings were stolen, plunging us into despair. Even so, for the sake of my education, they still decided to move to the city and live in the cinema where my dad worked. The following stories are about what we experienced in there. Nowadays, cinemas are just for watching movies, but back then, they were more like auditoriums, hosting various performances. The cinema was divided into 3 parts: the front building, the main hall, and the backstage building, all connected by the hall, forming a shape somewhat like half an H. When we first arrived, we lived in the front building. We were excited to be in a new place. My dad kept projecting films on schedule, while my mom set up a small snack shop at the cinema entrance. Gradually, our financial situation improved. But as time went on, we realized that the history of this cinema was far from the peaceful and quiet place it seemed to be now. Around the 1970s, the cinema was used as an execution ground for high-profile criminals. One of the executed was a young man whose mother insisted on his innocence. But despite her efforts, her son was executed, and she later hanged herself in the back building. In the 1980s, the local underworld gangs, mostly small-time thugs, appeared, and they often caused trouble. Once, during a fight inside the cinema, a young man was struck and killed by a high-speed spinning ceiling fan as onlookers stood on their seats to watch. But it was just deemed an accident, and the matter was soon forgotten. To be honest, knowing all this made me a bit uneasy. But I figured it all happened in the main hall and the backstage building, so even if there were ghosts, they wouldn't come over to the front building where we lived. Until one night, I accidentally overheard a conversation between my grandma and aunt, which left me in deep curiosity and horror. One day, my aunt came over to visit. After dinner, when my parents went to work and my brother went out to play, my aunt leaned in and quietly asked my grandma, "Does my brother still stay in that room?" "No, he moved downstairs." "So, he hasn't seen it again, right?" "I know it's superstitious, but better safe than sorry," my aunt said, lowering her voice even more. Grandma quickly signaled her to stop talking and sent me off to do my homework, but my curiosity was piqued. I kept pestering my aunt to tell me what it was until she finally relented, and what she said made me want to leave the cinema forever. One night after work, my dad went back to his room. As soon as he turned off the light, he saw a pale woman in a white dress staring at him from the dark. Startled, he quickly switched the light back on, but she was gone. Thinking it was just his imagination, he tried to brush it off and went back to bed. But as soon as the lights were out again, she reappeared, pushing him to the brink of insanity. From that night on, he soon moved out from that room and couldn't sleep with the lights off anymore. Hearing this, it felt like a bucket of ice water had been dumped over my head. Ghosts? Here? Then how could I stay here? That night, without hesitation, I ran straight to a friend's house to spend the night. Didn't even do my homework. Over the next few days, I was constantly on edge, but nothing happened. Gradually, I began to forget about it. But later, I learned that the lost souls lingering in the cinema were far more than just that grieving mother and the unfortunate young man. By the late 1980s, the entertainment industry was on the rise, and every area was forming its own song and dance troupes. Ours was no exception. These performances drew large crowds, but tickets were pricier than movie tickets. So during each show, troupe staff would station guard at the entrance to prevent local gangs from barging in without paying. Most performances went off without a hitch until this one. A low-ranking boss from the Qinglong gang, accompanied by a dozen thugs, tried to force their way in and ended up beating up one of the guards. After that, the show continued as usual and the troupe eventually left town. But a few days later, word got around that the gang leader had gone missing. But no one cared too much. He might have been kidnapped by rival gangs for all they knew. However, over the next several days, Uncle Chen and my dad noticed a foul stench lingering in the cinema. At first, they assumed it was coming from the bathroom and thought little of it. Then one day before opening, they saw something strange, a figure moving on the second floor to the right side. Was someone sneaking in to avoid buying a ticket? Without wasting any time, Dad and Uncle Chen rushed up to the second floor to investigate. Then they found out the stench on the second floor grew stronger, way worse than any smell from the bathroom. Realizing something was off, they decided to track down the source of the odor instead. While searching, they both heard noises coming from the far right room on the second floor, the room where the woman had hanged herself. Glancing nervously at each other, neither dared move. The two hesitated for what felt like forever before deciding against entering the room alone. Instead, they rounded up a few familiar faces among the gathering crowd downstairs to go with them. As the saying goes, there's strength in numbers. With backup in tow, they headed to the second floor. Everyone agreed the smell was definitely coming from that room. But knowing it and acting on it were two different things. No one dared to open the door. Finally, one man stepped forward and kicked it open. What they saw inside stopped everyone in their tracks. A heavily decomposed body was tied up in the room, emanating a gut-wrenching stench. The dead man's face was contorted in a grotesque expression, as if he had suffered immense pain before dying. Eventually, the police were called. The case was solved within days. The dead man was none other than the gang leader who had attacked the guard that night. It turned out that after the show ended, the guards who had been beaten captured him. They didn't intend to kill him, just drugged him lightly and locked him in the room, planning to leave him there hungry for a few days. No one anticipated it would end in death. But the autopsy revealed no clear cause of death. He hadn't been poisoned and showed no external injuries. Rumors spread that he might have been scared to death, given that his eyes and mouth were wide open in what appeared to be sheer terror. After that incident, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. It often felt like someone was watching me while I slept, so I ended up leaving the lights on at night too. Over time, though, as nothing happened, the fear would fade, but it never truly disappeared from our lives. It was the second half of 1992. I was in my final year of junior high, focusing on early mornings and late nights to prepare for exams. My parents, knowing how scared I was, accompanied me through those long days. Despite their support, there was a month when I was too afraid to go home and sleep. It all started with a classmate, a girl named Xu Yan. We had been in the same class for 3 years but never spoke. When the seating arrangements changed, she ended up sitting behind me, and we gradually got to know each other. One day, during a casual conversation, she revealed that she used to live in the cinema too. I felt a pang of embarrassment. If a girl wasn't afraid, why should I be? But then, one day, she poked my back, leaned in with an unsettling gaze, and asked, "Hey, did you ever feel like someone was watching you when you slept? Or touched you?" She said everyone who lived there had the same experiences until they couldn't take it anymore, and their father finally borrowed money to move out. I could see the lingering fear in her eyes, and I knew she wasn't lying. Oh God, I instantly regretted having that conversation. How was I supposed to sleep at home that night? By the time the school ended, it was completely dark. With no other choice, I forced myself to go home. As soon as I walked in, I saw my brother lying on the bed, staring blankly, his eyes red as if he'd been crying. My grandmother was watching TV with the volume cranked up. My parents were sitting nearby, silent and tense. The atmosphere was strange. I washed up, preparing for bed, when my dad suddenly said, "Let's leave the lights on tonight." No one else replied, but they all seemed to agree. Thank goodness. I was hoping for that. After what Xu Yan said, I'd been on edge all day. That night, my whole family felt unusually strange and quiet, and I couldn't fall asleep. Even while lying in bed, I could hear my grandmother and brother tossing and turning. It was clear they weren't sleeping well either. The next day, I went home for lunch as usual. Everything seemed back to normal. My brother was back to his mischievous ways, stealing food before we'd even started eating. I punched him, making him glare at me angrily. Then, with a deliberately sinister look, he said, "Oh, you hate me? Oh, Mom didn't want me to scare you, but do you know what I saw last night?" Before he could continue, my mom cut him off, glaring and saying, "What did you say? Just a cat?" "Somehow, a stray cat got in the cinema, jumping from the first floor to the second. Nothing special. Now, eat." My brother pouted and fell silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. Halfway through the meal, my brother and I started squabbling over a piece of cured meat. Suddenly, he threw his chopsticks at me and pointed at the kitchen door. "It wasn't a cat. I saw it. It was a headless ghost. It was standing right by the kitchen door. Grandma saw it too. It jumped up to the second floor room where the woman hanged herself and disappeared." With every word, I feel like ice was pouring over me. My breathing grew shallow as I turned to Grandma for an explanation, but she just kept telling me to eat and to ignore my brother's nonsense. It was painfully obvious she was avoiding the subject. My mom smacked my brother's hand with her chopsticks, and he looked ready to cry. But then, out of nowhere, he screamed. At the same time, my mom heard a ball at the kitchen door. Everything happened so fast, Dad and I jumped to our feet, terrified. My brother stared at the kitchen door, pale with fear, and my mom's eyes mirrored the same terror. Dad rushed to comfort my trembling brother, asking what happened, but he couldn't speak and just broke down crying. When Dad turned to Mom, she said it was a stray cat again. That obvious lie only made everything scarier. All afternoon in school, I felt like I was in a daze. Why was my brother so scared? What had my brother really saying? And why did Mom suddenly throw the ball? The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became. My brother had seen something terrifying. After classes ended that day, I didn't know what to do. Since moving in, I'd never seen them, but all the strange events made it impossible not to think of something sinister lurking nearby. I sat in my seat, lost in thought, until only Xinyun and I were left in the classroom. Xinyun lived far from the school and his family was poor, so the school had made special arrangements for him to stay in the radio station. Since we were pretty close friends, I asked if I could stay with him, and he agreed without hesitation. Overjoyed, I invited him over for dinner at my place. By the time Xinyun and I reached the back entrance of the cinema, it was already getting dark. My parents warmly welcomed my friends and, over dinner, mentioned that my younger brother and grandmother had gone to stay with my aunt, so they suggested I consider living at the school. When I told them about staying with Xinyun at the radio station, my parents expressed their deep gratitude to him. Then, out of nowhere, Xinyun casually asked my father, "Uncle, how many families live here?" "Just us. Why?" "Oh, I thought someone lived upstairs too." His words stunned everyone. My parents stared at him in shock, while Xinyun, oblivious to the tension, simply laughed and continued eating. But I was already drenched in cold sweat. What did he say? The upper floor was supposed to be unoccupied. In fact, it was sealed off when no performances were happening. No one could go up there. I was on the verge of losing it. I hadn't even figured out what happened that afternoon, and now there was this. I hurriedly urged Xinyun to finish eating. My mom handed me some money, and with my parents accompanying me, I practically fled the cinema. But even as we walked away, Xingyun kept glancing back at the second floor. I had no idea what might be lurking up here. Later, my grandmother finally told me everything that had happened. It all began the night before, right after dinner when I left for school and my grandmother and brother went for a walk. Upon returning, my brother saw a black shadow standing in the kitchen doorway. At first, he thought it was a visitor, but as they got closer, he realized the black shadow had no head. Terrified, my brother burst into tears. My grandmother, though as frightened, immediately began cursing at it while pulling my brother into the room. Maybe the cursing worked. The shadow suddenly floated up and disappeared on the second floor, the very room where the woman had hanged herself. Hearing the noise, my parents rushed out and saw them shouting at the second floor. They instantly understood everything. That night, Mom repeatedly told my brother it was just his eyes playing tricks on him, and my grandmother tried to reassure him by saying it was just a big stray cat. But my brother wasn't stupid. He knew they were just trying to comfort him. Afraid of getting scolded, he stopped arguing. That night, my grandmother suggested to my parents she take my brother to stay with my aunt for a while, since children with their weaker energy were more likely to say such things. But before they left, the next day at lunch, my brother saw it again, standing in the kitchen doorway. My mom understood immediately and threw her bowl at it, sending it flying up to the second floor. But the fact that this happened in broad daylight deeply unsettled the adults. How could it be so bold? Ever since I started living at the school, my parents were the only ones left in the back building of the cinema. On the surface, they pretended not to care about the strange occurrences, but they were under immense pressure. Eventually, these bizarre incidents became almost a routine part of our lives. For example, while cooking in the kitchen, a large snake suddenly coiled around Dad's leg, not harming him but seemingly issuing a warning to drive us away. On another occasion, after a movie screening, my father was once found crying backstage. When asked, he confessed that he had seen another version of himself walking on stage. These close brushes with despair and terror pushed my parents to the brink, and they finally decided to move. But due to financial constraints, we could only temporarily relocate to the building across the street through the government. The approved stay was only temporary, and a few months later, we had no choice but to move back. Fortunately, several days later, another family moved into the cinema. A young man named Ximao, who had once worked as a ticket seller along with his wife and child. I was genuinely happy about it. More people meant less fear, and Ximao's son, who was 4 years old, was a clever and adorable child, especially skilled at chess, giving me a new playmate. My parents quickly cleaned up a room for Ximao's family. When my father asked Ximao if he minded living there, which means a haunted place, he boldly declared he wasn't afraid and even worried about causing us any inconvenience. He was right. When faced with survival needs, the fear of ghosts seemed insignificant. Looking back now, I can't help but feel a pang of sadness. With their arrival, the added presence brought more vitality to the place, which my parents welcomed wholeheartedly. Not long after, Ximao brought his bedridden father to live with them, along with a large yellow dog. The dog was obedient, leaving to play during film screaming and returning at dusk. There was one troubling thing. It would often run up to the locked room on the second floor, the one where the hanging had occurred, and barked incessantly at the door. This behavior unnerved us all since, according to folklore, children and animals are believed to be sensitive to ghosts. The dog's relentless barking continued daily, becoming a source of irritation. Eventually, Ximao tied the dog outside to reduce the noise, but it kept barking toward the cinema. This made it hard for anyone to sleep peacefully. Frustrated, Ximao decided to drive the dog away. He picked up a stick and pretended to strike it, causing the yellow dog to flee in fear. It didn't come back for a long time, not until the following year. Life resumed the semblance of normalcy, and I focused on preparing for my high school entrance exams. With me occupied, Ximao's young son, having lost his playmate, took to catching a crayfish alone at a nearby ditch. I thought life had calmed down again, but fate had another plan. One day, A strange, eerie crying shattered our fragile peace and dragged us back into fear. It was the morning before I was due to return to school, and we were all awakened by that chilling sound. The crying came from outside the door, inhuman yet oddly human, sending chills down our spines. Everybody went down the stairs, but nobody did move. After a while, my father, determined and furious, grabbed an iron rod and cautiously opened the door. What we saw made everyone recoil in shock. There was a yellow dog, kneeling on his front legs, tears streaming down his eyes as he looked at us. Each movement of his mouth emitted a low, mournful wail. Ximao's son was happy to see it and ran over to hug it, and the dog licked its hand gently before resuming its cries. But we were all stunned. How can a dog cry in this way? And what did that mean? After 3 days of exams, I came home excitedly for dinner. The kitchen was filled with the aroma of a special meal, but as I approached, I sensed a heavy atmosphere. I assumed my parents were worried about my exams, so I reassured them that I thought it went well. They forced a smile and invited me to eat. Noticing that Ximao's door was closed, I shouted, "Hey, little buddy, want to play chess tonight?" There was no response. Just as I approached to knock, a blood-curdling cry erupted from inside, startling me. At that time, my brother whispered that Ximao's son had drowned while catching crayfish. I was shocked. Such a sweet child, gone. Tears streamed down my face. That evening, my grandmother explained what had happened. After I left for school, the boy had gone to catch crayfish as usual, accompanied by the yellow dog. Nobody paid him much attention until lunchtime when he hadn't returned. His mother began calling for him, but only the dog came back, circling her and tugging on her pants, trying to lead her outside. Thinking it was being playful, she pushed it away, but it kept pulling her toward the door. When she finally followed, she saw her son standing on the stage, with back turning to her. She scolded him, then turned to the kitchen, but when she glanced back, he was gone. Unease settled in, and she followed the dog all the way to the ditch, where she found her son lying face down in the water, already gone. In our town, children who died were not allowed back into their homes or given traditional burials. My parents, ignoring these customs, sprinkling it with ammonium carbonate for preservation. Neighbors came to pay their respects that night. As dawn broke, Ximao placed his son in a large crayfish-shaped container, serving as a makeshift coffin, and buried him. Later, people spoke of the dog's eerie cries, saying it must have been a warning. According to Chinese folklore, dogs and cats really cry, but when they do, it foretells death. Tragically, it was too late to change anything. There are still plenty of stories about that old cinema, but we were going to wrap things up here for now. We'll dig into the rest in the next video. Honestly, in my hometown, there's a similar belief that when animals cry, it can be a sign of an impending death. It reminds me of a news story I once read about a death cat in a nursing home. Whenever the cat got extra close to a resident, that person would pass away within a few days. So people started calling it the death cat. But later on, experts explained that as people near death, their bodies release a unique scent due to feeling bodily functions, something only animals with sharp senses can detect. But when it comes to the story like the one we just heard, maybe it's just another sign that animals have some sort of special sixth sense